What we're going to talk about today is the most basic question as you begin writing a piece of nonfiction, which is, how do you find a good story idea? That's a question that has many implications. It's not only how do you find a good idea, but how do you figure out if it's an idea that will work? Now, if you've been given an assignment, you don't have to worry about this. Then you have no choice. But let's assume that you are finding your own subject, or that you want to come up with a story to propose to an editor. To begin with, I think you have to go to the most elemental issue, which is curiosity. Are you curious about this subject? Is it an authentic curiosity? That means really sitting down and thinking to yourself, would I read this story? Do I really want to know who or what this subject is all about? In practical terms, is this subject too narrow or too broad? That's a really important point to make, because readers have to know the extent of what the subject is as they begin reading a story. If it is a profile of your Uncle Fred, who nobody knows and nobody cares about and nobody can draw any further lessons from Uncle Fred, you may be looking at something too narrow. If you are writing a profile of an ordinary person who can stand as an example of a bigger subject, then you're starting to see a topic that, while it's narrow, it's sort of funnels out. It touches more than its own specific subject. It's really important to use that assessment, especially if you're writing about subjects that are at least initially ordinary. And I use that word with some hesitation because it sounds really negative. If you approach an editor with a subject that's very, very narrow, you're absolutely going to have to defend it on those terms. This is both a specific example of something, and it can stand as an iconic example of something bigger. If you're passionate about a subject, that is in itself a good reason to pursue it. But it also helps to step back a little and take into account the more practical issues that might arise with any subject matter. How long will you need in terms of page and word count to tell this story effectively? It's useful to begin seeing a shape of a story even before you've begun working on it. Who will want to read this story? You could say to yourself, I'm so passionate about this subject that it will simply draw people in because I'm going to explain to them my passion for the subject, and I'm entirely in support of that. But I also think it's helpful to imagine the reader who might be drawn to the subject because of the subject, not just because of your passion. I'm a great believer in being very responsive to your own enthusiasm and interest in the subject. I happen to think that if you really are excited about a story and you are really drawn to understanding it, you're going to bring along a lot of readers who will share and be interested in your enthusiasm. So that in itself can be part of what the appeal is. I think that the great analog for this is imagining a dinner party and everybody's chatting and there are a lot of conversations going on. Suddenly someone will break in and say, I had the most amazing thing happen to me the other day when I was in Indianapolis. Now, the reason I say Indianapolis is that that is not normally a place where people go, oh my God, I want to hear all about Indianapolis. But if you are sitting in a group and someone with enormous passion and energy and purpose says, I have to tell you about this remarkable trip I had to Indianapolis, you're going to listen. That can be the measure as you're thinking about a story idea. Can you be that person at the dinner party to say, I have this amazing story to tell about my Uncle Fred? Normally, people would say, I have an Uncle Fred too. I don't see why I should be interested in your Uncle Fred. But if you can say, as a writer, this is a truly exciting, interesting story, or it is a story I'm going to tell with such grace and such intimacy, you are going to want to be part of it with me. That's the way to judge if a story is going to work. That's the kind of abstract notion of how to assess whether something's a good story idea or not. But the question is, how do you even find stories? The single most important thing that you can cultivate as a writer, and certainly it is important for us at The New Yorker, is finding your own ideas. The minute you finish writing a story, you will be convinced that there are no more story ideas left in the world. Don't be alarmed. This happens to me every time I write a story. I find story ideas everywhere, all the time. And when I say everywhere, I really mean everywhere. I mean reading newspapers that I don't subscribe to, reading magazines, flipping through the back of magazines, walking around, seeing billboards, overhearing conversations, being open to ideas, having something click and letting yourself follow it to the next step. This is the only way you can find good story ideas, is to be out in the world, collecting, sifting, constantly absorbing information till something clicks and you can say, I want to know more about that. This also means following a lot of ideas that don't end up working as a story, and that's fine. Your percentage of ideas you pursue to the ones you actually believe will work as a story doesn't have to be high. In fact, it's probably great to practice following an idea and saying, not going to work. I'm going to give you a couple examples of stories that I worked on and how I came to those ideas. I was in a supermarket buying food for dinner, and I thought, how do they get all the food in here? How do they move all these boxes in? How do they decide what they keep in a store? I love taking that subject that's so obvious, but in fact, when you think about it, you really know nothing about it. It's a, to me, very, very alluring idea to say, you know, I thought I knew something about this, but I actually don't know anything about it. Taking the obvious, pulling it apart, finding what it really is all about. Another story that I pursued that came about in a very different way. Visiting a friend, and he happened to be out of the room. I was trying to keep myself occupied. He happened to have a catalog from a taxidermy supply company. Who knew there was such a thing as a taxidermy supply company? I didn't. I flipped through it and it was hundreds of pages. So this is the other way of following a story impulse for me. And that is the complete opposite of the obvious story. It's the one of, I had no idea. It was right here under my nose the whole time.